This is a 98 Chevy Blazer, 4-wheel drive. It has a problem with the 4-wheel drive not working. It has 243,000 miles on it. I've jacked the front end up off the ground and set both wheels on jack stands. They're mounted on the control arm. You can go inside and start it up. This is regular 4-wheel drive, it's not the auto 4-wheel drive. It's set on 2-wheel drive. I'll select 4-wheel drive and listen for the shift motor to engage. And it did. With the vehicle running, this should be turning the front drive shaft, and it isn't. So first thing I want to check is the system split up into two parts. The first part is the shift motor that locks the drive shaft in to the transfer case, and it is locked into the transfer case. So if I spin the front wheel, the drive shaft should be trying to spin back and forth, and it isn't. So that means that the axle actuator's not hooking the axles together on the passenger side. And more than likely, transmission fluids infiltrated it through the switch on the transfer case and saturated the diaphragm and busted it. It happens a lot. To check that, over here this vacuum tree on the driver's side. And there's a hose coming from the main vacuum of the engine, and a hose going down to the transmission, or the transfer case rather. And pull that hose off, the one coming up from the transfer case here, and it should have engine vacuum on it if it's running. If it doesn't, then there's a problem up here, but this does. So the next thing I'm doing, this is a vacuum line heading down underneath the battery tray. And if you got a vacuum tester, you can hook it onto that line over there, pinch it off here, and make sure that the line's holding vacuum and it's not burned up from laying down on the exhaust manifolds like this one was, but it didn't burn a hole in it. I pulled it up off the manifold, just burnt the sheathing up, but the vacuum line's got solid vacuum on it, so it's just vacuum's just passing through it, and that means the switch is working on the transfer case. If you've got vacuum on that line over there and vacuum's coming out over here and going down underneath the battery box. This vacuum line has vacuum on it, but it's not being contained. It's just passing through it. So either the vacuum hose has a hole, or it's come off of the actuator underneath the battery box, or the actuator's got a hole in it. So I'm going on to the next step of taking the battery tray out of it. A lot of times the switch will be bad, and it'll suck transmission fluid from the transfer case up the vacuum line and saturate the actuator underneath this battery box. So anyway, this line going underneath the battery tray has vacuum on it, so the switch is working down on the transfer case. The next thing I need to do is pull the battery out of it. Make sure the switch is off, everything's off. We'll take these battery terminals loose and a 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter nut off the battery hold down and pull the battery out of it. Once the battery's out of it, take the 2 bolts out of the battery tray front and lift it off of the battery hold down stud on the inner fender. Pull the battery tray up out of there. Yep, that was the problem, alright. The actuator is full of transmission fluid and has a ripped diaphragm. It sits in a bracket with 3 screws, and the bracket's bolted by these 2 13 millimeter headed bolts on the inner fender above the passenger tire. Take those 2 bolts loose and pull this bracket and actuator out of there. The cable's got a spearhead that slides into this, and you just lift this wire. It's got a cut in this tube, and you just lift this wire up and pull the spearhead out. Just stick the new one in and push it in there, and it'll lock on under this wire. And screw the new one back down in the same position the old one was in. Put the bracket retaining bolts back down. Put the battery tray bolts back in. Clean up your battery terminals if it needs it. And put your battery back down in there. And then start it up and apply your 4-wheel drive. I've applied vacuum to the line going down to the transfer case, and it comes up from the switch. It goes through this actuator and now the drive shaft is turning this a lot harder. Four-wheel drive work on it now. Since that actuator is full of transmission fluid, I'm going to have to go down underneath and change the vacuum switch on the transfer case to keep that from rolling this new actuator. And check the transfer case fluid level. I'm down underneath the driver's side where the front drive shaft goes into the transfer case, and just behind it is that switch up above the front drive shaft, and behind it right there. This is a new replacement one. Has 3 tubes sticking off of it and a ball on the bottom of it. I've selected 2-wheel drive to take the old switch out. I think it takes the load off of this actuator ball. Make sure your actuator ball isn't stuck or something. Go down the drive shaft along its length and unplug those vacuum lines. Off of it. Just like that. And just lay them up there on top of the fuel line. Now the replacement 7/8. I've got that sensor loosened up. I'm going to go ahead and take a air hose and blow the dirt off from around the threads. Just lay it on my belly and reach over and get it. Sucking the stuck ball stuck up in there. That's nice. It has an O-ring underneath of it to seal it up. The switch is tilted forward. It's probably about 11 o'clock. If you try to start it in straight, you won't make it very far. I've just been putting my hand over the dry shaft and laying face down. This works a lot better on a lift. I've got the front wheels about 10 inches off the ground. I'll go ahead and tighten the new switch down. The switch has a little dowel pin on it, so the alignment's not wrong. It's got a little dowel pin sticking up, and then the rubber plug-in has a hole to accommodate the sticking up extra tower there, little stubby one. Right, it's on there and pushed all the way down so it doesn't pop off. Just kind of push around. The dowel pin was facing toward the rear of the transfer case, and it should kind of poke up through that set of rubber wires. And that'll keep the transmission fluid from ruining the vacuum actuator under the battery box. I went ahead and dropped the skid plate. It had 3 13mm across the back and 2 15mm nuts holding up to the rear mount. And I need to clean that fill plug off a little bit. This is a drain plug. And fill this full of fluid with the vehicle level. And it's going to take a 10mm hex head socket with a ratchet to break it loose. That's nice. And fill it with Dextran 3 transmission fluid with a newer 6 equivalent. And it seems like some fluid's getting ready to run out of it. I'll set a drain pan under it. Maybe it's overfilled. Man, this thing was really overfilled. I kind of wonder if the seal's bad. And blew all that back in if we overfilled that thing like that. But that's a gallon anyway. Come out of that port was level. Now I'm going to go ahead and put the skid plate back on it. I'll have to make sure the transmission fluid stays up on it after a nice uphill drive. With about 3.5 quarts of excess fluid in the transfer case, the front seal on the transfer case has failed, and the transmission fluid is getting sent back into it. And I drained it out, but what will happen over time is the fluid will keep leaving the transmission, and it can't suffer a 3-quart loss. without tearing the transmission up. But the transfer case needs pulled off and a new front seal put on it. But that's another project. The combination of this four-wheel drive vacuum switch being bad and it overfilled with fluid from the seal bad in the transfer case is causing fluid to get up into the four-wheel drive vacuum actuator up in the front. It's got the cable that engages the axle, but the transfer case is locking the drive shaft in fine.